is that I think there's some wave, there's definitely a wave moving that many of us are plugging into. So we call it an aquifer, maybe. And so it's really lovely to hear very similar resonant language, Maria, of what you're saying, and that although I've never met you. But I think where I'll start, given what you've sort of initiated here in the field, is to underline my own strong sense, as you've said, that we are in the midst of initiation. I often say that I think we all, actually, men and women, but I'm going to say women have a particular role here, and I'll say more about that in a moment, are in the midst of a profound rite of passage. And like any real initiation or true initiation, there is sacrifice involved. There is a kind of bowing down required in the moving into something new. This is true in any original cultures who used initiation. We've lost this for the most part in our Western culture, that there actually could be healthy ways to guide these initiatory times. But I have the sense, and this has been my own research. By the way, it's worse. I mean, in terms of being a bridge person, when I realized there was something to explore about women and development, like how women actually emerge. And I realized it wasn't just how do we fit ourselves more effectively inside the masculine paradigm, but that we were actually going somewhere new. I made sure to put my programs inside a university setting. This was a way that I wanted to bridge the research that I wanted to do with the mainstream, because I think, and in fact I'm quite sure now, that the work that we have to do as women right now needs to translate in terms of how we actually show up in the world the way it is. If we are going to make the changes which we are going to have to make and shape the world during these times, we have to be in the world, not all exiting to remote places. Yeah. So that was really important to me, that that the consideration of what is actually happening could be validated in a way. So it's kind of how you hold both the mainstream paradigm and one that has absolutely, well, it's kind of transcending. It includes that paradigm, but it's really breaking way outside of that box. Yeah. And this, in my own work of basically, I'd say trial and error. I started out with the first program I ever ran was called Women's Integral Leadership Circle. And the integral model, which some of you may be familiar with, was a very good grounding model for me, because it was the first one I'd seen that actually brought in all dimensions of reality. And I loved that map, to be able to examine, what's missing, what are we not looking at? And I had this view of gender inside of it, or the feminine and the masculine, that was quite simplistic. Actually, it was the place where I started. But over the course of 10 years, really began to unpack, what did I mean by that? What do I mean by feminine and masculine? And initially, I used other words even, because I think feminine and masculine can get confused in terms of gender, male and female. And I think we're going to some places with gender that we have, way outside our current boxes right now. So in a moment, I want to talk about feminine and masculine, but I am speaking about how those two primary yin or yang forces co-arise inside men and women. But what I see, what we were tracking in terms of, how do women develop then? What is the next level of this development that actually is going to give birth to a way of being that's never been before? How does that fit with with the whole move of evolution? And my co-author, Susan Cannon, was doing her research at the time in looking at culture and how culture unfolds. So we really were watching these two co-arise together, both our own development as women, and how does that fit inside the great story, the narrative of evolution itself. And I go into much more of this in our book, but what I just want to lay out now is, if we go way back, we can see the first, what we call the first feminine epoch, came in about 50,000 years. We had this epoch, and I'm going to just speak to what we would say 6 waves that have happened since the beginning of time, of human Homo sapien, that pretty much all futurists or historians would agree have occurred. These are waves of consciousness and culture. And every time a new wave comes in, it brings in a new consciousness, certain kind of complexity, and different capacities, just different leadership paradigms. That's how that works. And the reason that the waves come in and shift is because the consciousness that created the issues in the culture simply isn't adequate to meet that challenge. So evolution, there's a push again. Evolution urges consciousness to expand, for the perspective to become wider and deeper. So that's happened. We know we can map that over six cycles so far. And the first we call the feminine epoch was the first 2 waves came in. That was about 50,000 years. And then we have at about 3000 AD, we have about the BCE, we have the first masculine wave come in. And that wave then follows with 4 other waves. And some of you will know those waves as if you map any of the culture that go through the warrior wave, the traditional wave, the modern wave, postmodern wave. Well, that's 5,000 years then of a masculine worldview. And where we would say we are now is when the postmodern wave came in, mid-60s, we would say that's the beginning of the second feminine epoch. And it has a very dynamic energy, in contrast to the first 50,000 years, which was much more mother-like and all-containing. This energy is very dynamic. It's breaking things up, shaking things up. That was the sexual revolution, rock and roll, sex-free, love, drugs, kind of wanting to bust up the 5,000 years of patriarchy. And now, this is key to say, because we're in a transition from the 6th wave to the 7th wave, which some are calling the integral wave. And what we absolutely know is every time there is a move between waves, it's very chaotic. There's a lot of disintegration of the old. There's a lot of shake-up, rock and roll time. What we also know is that it takes a small population, it's actually not terribly, it's not everybody, who are on this frothy edge of evolution, who can hold a vision of a new world emerging in the midst of everything breaking down. And so this is really important to say, because I think it situates some of what you were saying, Maria, and certainly what I do in my own work, which is there is suffering right now. We are pressing up against the limitations of what I call an old operating system. And it was an operating system that was very effective. It wasn't a mistake. I don't believe life made a wrong turn. That was evolution unfolding. But it simply has reached the end of its, that paradigm is no longer adequate. We actually need now the deep feminine to come into relationship with a healthy masculine in a way it never has been before. It's not about going back to what we've had. It's about actually holding space for something really different. So what I find when I speak or when people read my book, one of the things I hear the most commonly is a relief to know that what they're experiencing is not a regression, or that there's something wrong with me, that I am suffering right now, that I am, and there are many ways that I see that in my own work when women come in to see me or in my programs. It's this combination of both. I can't seem to see how to get my inside aligned with my outside, and there's suffering in that dynamic. And I have a longing for a new way of being. I can see something, but I can't touch it yet and taste it yet. Now, what I absolutely agree with what you're saying, Maria, about the need to come down and in, and that's the language I use a lot. At this point, the work we have to do then, once we recognize ourselves as women on this frothy edge of evolution, in the rough and tumble of it all, we have to, some of us, be willing to do the work to shift the codes, and I talk about them in this way. And there are old embodied codes. After 5,000 years, you can be sure there would be, hypermasculine now, and they are deep in the cells here. So this is not, it's not adequate for, a positive affirmation on the mirror, although intention is super powerful, and we can, learn to harness that potent visual capacity. But if we aren't also doing the work of unhooking from the deep shadows that were a part of that earlier code, we will not be able to make the changes. We have a kind of homeostatic stasis that goes on in the psyche. So the work I do, and that I'm really interested in helping women do, it's an accelerated way, because I think ultimately with time, evolution is going to urge this anyway. The feminine is going to come online. There is going to be a sacred marriage, and we are going to give birth to ways of being that have never, ever existed before, almost a new species. But I'm interested in the time we have, given the limited resource on this earth. Therefore, some of us have to be willing to do this deep work. And it requires kind of turning back toward the developmental traumas that occurred, both in our early family of origin, because we lived as women inside cultures that haven't validated women, and because we have the epigenetic pass down that comes to us. So in all those levels, we have trauma. Now, the trauma body actually can be our friend. This was a very wise way that we learned to get love, safety, and belonging. We wired together a particular way of being, the head, the heart, and the hara, all one system. We have a good structure that actually allows us to come into the world and exist as a human. But that conditioned self and the conditioned mind is now a limitation to the expansion of consciousness that simply wants to happen. So the only way to really, in my opinion, or the one key way, is we have to be willing to do that metabolizing while we are bringing online some of these higher frequencies. If not, you get, I think you were referring to this, Maria, perhaps anyway, in what you were talking about coming into the body, you can get the spiritual bypass happening. And I was certainly, I put my hand up and say I did that. I don't regret the mystery schools I was a part of and all the ways I learned to work at these very high vibratory realms, but they hadn't come all the way into the body. And we have to come all the way into the body now and do the other work of the unhooking, the unwinding from that old structure. So maybe I'll just finish my own little piece here by saying, by using this, because I love the words of Thich Nhat Hanh, who speaks to this. And while so many of us are tilted naturally and need to be toward the world and taking care of the world, we see ourselves as agents of change. We want to come into the world as women who can really shape these times. I call us Mysterial Woman. The name of my book is The Way of the Mysterial Woman, Upgrading How You Live, Love, and Lead. Mysterial simply is a word that was invented because I couldn't find a word to describe this new species coming in, basically. But for those of us that are doing this and are the ones on the edge of evolution, because we see that we have to bring a new consciousness into our beautiful blue planet. And he says, Thich Nhat Hanh says this: go back and take care of yourself. Your body needs you. Your feelings need you. Your perceptions need you. Your suffering needs you to acknowledge it. Go home and be there for all these things. Yeah, I think I'll just let those words rest my time. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Mm. Mm.
You're bringing to mind, and what I would see with women a lot in birth, and when I'm working with initiatory processes with women and with myself, how without fail, every time I have experienced stepping into more power, opening up to more power, or supporting a woman and opening up to more power, a layer of wounding or trauma is there. It's arising for healing. And how there's this, we're talking about, and seeing that the filter of birth, right? Something is emerging. Something is also, there's death. And I'm really hearing that. And again, this is another thread that I'm hearing throughout the tending to the grief.
Yeah.
And the importance of it. And I know before we've talked in some of our other conversations about the discomfort of this process that we're in, and transparently stepping on this path to leadership, I have cried the most uncomfortable cries I've ever experienced. It's like this grief that is coming from my toes. Like it's just so deep. And I feel grateful for the containers and the people and the ways that I can allow that to move through. What would you say to the women, the people who are starting to touch in on this right now? What kind of support can they call in to move through this? Or if there's anything you would like to share about that process, the process of tending grief?
Thank you. There are two things actually. And the first thing is, I think naming, as I was saying before, naming this moment helps normalize that. So that's the first thing. You are not alone. The second thing I want to say, and this is something I think you were touching on, Maria, you said something about being emptied out at some point. But when you said that, what your own experience, I thought, I will share a tiny bit about my own experience of that. I have found in the students that come to me and the women I work with, this is pretty common right now. I don't really know many of us that aren't having the experience. And for myself, I would say there's a humbling process going on. Right when we'd finished the research and the book was ready to be published, actually in 2012, and we're coming back to run our first program after a couple of years of taking time to write. And on January the 3rd, I came home to find my husband dead. And all I can say, in a simple way to say this would be, all of the structures of my life as I knew them, all of the fields of belonging that mattered to me, were gone within 6 months. I mean, literally gone, almost like a Tibetan sand painting mandala, where there's that beautiful process, and at the end, the monks just clear it with their hands. I had a beautiful life with a beloved husband and an estate on a beautiful island near Seattle, and a community, and where we had people come and did retreats. And this would never have been something that would have been imaginable for me or for anybody who knew me. And I now feel, I would say the first thing that I did, and partly because I know this works so well, was to surrender. A good friend of mine who lives on the same island, Michael Mead, who's done a lot of work with myth and ritual, with men especially, said to me, came over the next day, and in my work and in my book, I work with a myth, a Greek myth, a descent myth, the Persephone Demeter myth, where she is pulled into Hades, as you may know if you know the myth, Persephone, while she's picking flowers. And the reason I work with that myth is because, of course, when she's pulled in, it's this enormous transformative process that occurs, and she emerges. Although she resists it at first, she ultimately reemerges as goddess of the upper world and the underworld, which is, to me, what we need to be doing now as women today. But the resistance that she did at the beginning is what is not helpful. And Michael said to me, one thing is you are Queen Persephone. You know how to go down. Because with every program I run, we do a ritual process of taking women into the depths. But you are going to go to a depth you've never been before. So go, and we bless you as you go. And to really not resist, that's probably what I would say right now, it's like, you're giving, if you're giving birth, you don't clamp down. You'll let the contractions come. You will bear down, but you will be with the suffering. And I think that's what Thich Nhat Hanh is saying in that quote. Really, we come back and are tender with ourselves, and that's probably what I leave this piece with, Alexis, is just our own self-compassion for the courage actually to give birth to ourselves so that we can give birth to a really new world. Yeah.
Thank you so much. And that's so powerful. And I hear we have to become the vessel that can birth
Absolutely.
this new earth, these new ways.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Thank you.